The heat of the afternoon sun did not burn as hot as the restlessness in the heart of the younger son. He stood by the edge of the terrace, looking out over the vast vineyards and olive groves that stretched toward the horizon. To anyone else, this view was a blessing, a testament to generations of labor, favor, and the protective hand of God. But to him, it looked like a prison. The stone walls of the estate, solid and ancient, felt less like a fortress of safety and more like the bars of a cage that was slowly suffocating his spirit. He paced the stone floor, the sound of his sandals echoing in the quiet courtyard. Inside the house, the servants were moving softly, preparing for the evening meal. The order of the household was perfect. Everything had its place. Everything happened at its appointed time. And he hated it. He hated the predictability. He hated the submission. He hated the waiting. For years, he had watched his father, the patriarch, rule with a gentle but firm hand. His father was a man of immense dignity, respected at the city gates, honored by the elders, and loved by his workers. Yet the younger son could not find it in his heart to admire this. He only felt the weight of the shadow he was forced to live under. He stopped pacing and looked at his hands. They were young, strong, and empty. He wanted to fill them with the world. He had heard stories from the merchants who passed through the village, stories of the far country. They spoke of cities that never slept, of music that stirred the blood, of pleasures that did not require permission. There, a man was defined by his wealth and his wit, not by whose son he was. The longing to be there, to be his own master, had grown from a whisper into a scream that drowned out every prayer and every instruction. He knew what he had to do. The thought had terrified him at first, for it was a thought that no son in their culture dared to entertain. It was forbidden, not by written law, but by the sacred bond of blood and honor. But the desire for independence had calloused his conscience. He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the guilt that tried to rise in his throat. Today would be the day. The patriarch was sitting in the cool of the inner room, reviewing the accounts of the harvest. He looked up as his younger son entered. The father's eyes were warm, filled with a depth of knowledge that always made the son feel transparent, as if his very soul were exposed. "Father," the young man said. His voice was steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The father set down the scroll. He did not speak. He simply waited. His silence was an invitation, a space of grace that the son was about to fill with a weapon. "Father," the son repeated, stepping closer, ensuring his shadow fell across the desk. "Give me the share of the estate that falls to me." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The silence that followed was not the peaceful silence of the afternoon. It was the silence of a structure collapsing. In their world, in their time, inheritance was a matter of death. To ask for it now was to disrupt the natural order of life. It was a declaration that the father lived too long. It was a statement that said, clearly and brutally, "I value your gold more than your breath. I want you out of the way." The father did not gasp. He did not stand up in a rage to strike his son, though the law and the custom gave him every right to do so. A lesser man would have torn his robes. A lesser man would have banished the insolent child with a curse. But this father sat perfectly still. His eyes, which had seen the boy take his first steps and speak his first words, now saw the utter rejection in the young man's stance. The younger son braced himself for the shout, for the back of a hand, for the lecture on honor and duty. He had prepared his arguments. He was ready to fight for his freedom, but the fight never came. Instead, a profound sorrow washed over the father's face. It was not the sorrow of a victim, but the sorrow of one who sees a tragedy unfolding and knows he cannot stop it by force. He looked at his son, really looked at him, seeing past the arrogance and the greed, seeing the brokenness that the boy did not yet know he carried. "You wish to leave," the father said softly. It was not a question. "I wish to live," the younger son retorted, defensive in the face of such gentleness. "I am wasting away here. I want what is mine. I want to build my own life by my own rules." "What is yours?" the father repeated, the words tasting like ash. He stood up slowly. The weight of his age seemed to descend upon him in that single moment. He walked to the window and looked out at the fields he had cultivated for decades, the legacy he had hoped to pass on intact. "You ask for separation. You ask to tear the inheritance from the source." "I ask only for what I am owed by birth," the son insisted. his entitlement shielding him from the cruelty of his demand. The father turned back. There was no anger in his eyes, only a terrifying resolve. Very well. The younger son blinked, stunned. You will do it? Love that is forced is not love, the father said, his voice trembling slightly. If your heart is already in the far country, I will not keep your body here in chains. He called for the steward. When the servant entered and heard the command, he dropped the clay pitcher he was holding. It shattered on the floor, the sound sharp and violent. The servant looked from the father to the son, his eyes wide with horror. To divide the living, to liquidate the assets of the patriarch while he still sat at the head of the table, it was an abomination. Do as I say, the father commanded, his voice firm. Call the scribes, summon the older son, we will divide the living. The younger son felt a surge of triumph, a rush of adrenaline that masked the sickening feeling in his gut. He had won. He had faced the patriarch and walked away with a kingdom. He did not see the tear that traced a path down his father's cheek as he turned to leave the room. He did not understand that in getting exactly what he wanted, he had just lost the only thing that mattered. Your support breathes life into these timeless truths and gives strength to those finding their way home. Please like and subscribe to help us share the stories that the world often forgets. And stay with us, because the road to the far country is darker than you imagine, and the miracle awaiting at the end is something you won't believe. News traveled faster than the wind in the small village. By the time the sun had set on that fateful day, every household knew what had happened in the great estate on the hill. The whispers began in the market, spread to the wells, and echoed in the synagogues. They called it a scandal. They called it a funeral for the living. The elders shook their heads, spitting on the ground to ward off the evil of such rebellion. They spoke of the younger son with disdain, but they spoke of the father with confusion. Why had he agreed? Why had he not beaten the boy into submission? Inside the estate, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The older son stood in the courtyard, his arms crossed over his chest, his face like thunder. He watched as the scribes tallied the cattle, the sheep, and the acres of land. He watched as his birthright was sliced open to satisfy the greed of his brother. You are mad, the older son hissed as the younger brother walked past him, carrying a bundle of deeds. You are tearing this family apart. Do you have no shame? The younger son stopped and smirked, his eyes gleaming with the fever of his newfound wealth. I am taking what is mine, brother. You enjoy playing the servant. You enjoy waiting for a grave to open before you start living. I do not. I am freeing myself. Freeing yourself? The older son laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You are humiliating him. Look at him. He gestured toward the main house, where the father sat silently by the window. He walks like a ghost in his own home because of you. You are killing him without a weapon. The younger son flinched, but he quickly hardened his heart. He agreed. It is done. Save your lectures for your oxen. The days that followed were a blur of frantic activity. The younger son did not want land. He could not carry fields to the far country. He did not want flocks. Sheep were a burden to a man seeking pleasure. He wanted gold. He wanted silver. He wanted the liquid power that would open doors in the cities of the foreigners. And so, the fire sale began. It was a feeding frenzy. Merchants from neighboring towns, smelling the desperation and the haste, descended upon the estate like vultures. They knew the boy wanted to leave immediately. They knew he cared nothing for the true value of the heritage. I will give you half of what this field is worth, a merchant said, eyeing the prime soil that had been in the family for 6 generations. Done, the younger son said, signing the parchment without a second glance. This flock is the finest in the region, another buyer noted, stroking his beard. But since you are in a rush, just give me the coin, the younger son snapped, his hand extended. The older son watched from the shadows, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle of his hoe. Every transaction was a knife wound. Every acre sold was a betrayal of their ancestors. He hated his brother in those moments, but he also felt a dark, simmering resentment toward his father. Why do you let him do this? He screamed silently. Why do you let him burn down what we have built? But the father did not intervene. He signed where he needed to sign. He transferred ownership. He allowed the mutilation of his estate. He knew that for the son to learn the truth, he had to be allowed to believe the lie completely. The father was playing a game of eternity, while the son was playing for the moment. Finally, The last deed was signed, the last coin collected. The younger son stood in his chamber, a heavy bag of wealth tied to his belt. He was dressed in new traveling clothes, fine linen that set him apart from the workers he was leaving behind. He looked around the room where he had grown up. He felt no nostalgia, only relief. He was escaping a small life for a big one. He walked out into the courtyard. The sun was high, casting short, sharp shadows. The servants stopped their work and lowered their heads, not out of respect, but out of embarrassment. They could not look at him. To them, he was already dead. He was cutting himself off from the community, from the covenant, from the protection of the family name. The father was waiting at the gate. He did not block the way. He stood to the side, his hands open, empty. The younger son stopped for a brief moment. A sudden, terrifying thought crossed his mind, a flash of fear about the unknown world beyond the hills. But the weight of the gold at his waist reassured him. He had the means. He had the power. "Goodbye, father," he said. He did not ask for a blessing. He knew he had forfeited it. "Go," the father whispered. His voice was thick with unshed tears. "And when the world has finished with you, remember this gate is not locked." The younger son did not understand the words. He nodded curtly, turned his back on the patriarch, and stepped out onto the road. He walked with a bounce in his step, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the sky seemed bluer and the promises seemed brighter. He did not look back. If he had, he would have seen the figure of the father, standing like a statue in the dust, watching him until he was nothing more than a speck in the distance. He would have seen the older brother turn away in disgust and spit on the footprints he had left behind. As the younger son crested the first hill, the familiar sights of home disappeared, the olive trees, the stone walls, the safety. He was alone now. The silence of the road was different from the silence of the estate. It was vast and indifferent. But he smiled. He reached down and touched the money pouch. "I am free," he said to the empty air. But the wind that blew past him was cold, carrying with it the scent of a storm that was yet far off, a storm that would not break for many days. But when it did, it would shatter everything he thought he possessed. The journey to the far country had begun, and with every step, he was walking further away from himself, believing he was finding himself. The tragedy was not that he left. The tragedy was that he thought he was escaping a prison, when in reality, he was stepping out of a fortress and into a wilderness that knew no mercy. The road away from the father's house was longer than the younger son had anticipated, not in miles, but in the shedding of his identity. For the first few days, he walked with the rhythm of his homeland still in his feet. He woke at the hours of prayer, though he did not pray. He hesitated before eating food sold by roadside merchants, his stomach tightening with the instinct of dietary laws he had followed since birth. But with every league that put distance between him and the estate, the heavy cloak of tradition began to slip from his shoulders. He did not walk alone for long. With a bag of gold and silver weighing down his belt, he soon found that the world was eager to accommodate him. He purchased a horse, a strong beast that elevated him above the common travelers. He hired a small guard, men with scarred faces and silent tongues who asked no questions as long as the coin was good. For the first time in his life, he gave orders that were obeyed not out of familial duty or affection, but out of the cold, hard transaction of commerce. It was an intoxicating feeling. He realized that in this wider world, his father's name meant nothing, but his father's money meant everything. As they crossed the borders into the Gentile lands, the very air seemed to change. The strict, ordered silence of Judea was replaced by a chaotic, vibrant noise. He saw temples dedicated to gods he had been taught to despise. Yet now, staring at their marble pillars, he felt a strange thrill of rebellion. He was walking through the forbidden, and the sky did not fall. The lightning did not strike. He felt invincible. He arrived at the capital of the far country at twilight. It was a city that did not close its eyes when the sun went down. The gates were wide open, swallowing caravans, soldiers, and wanderers. He rode through the archway, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had expected to feel lost, but instead, he felt like a conqueror entering a city he intended to subdue. He looked at the faces of the people-painted women, merchants shouting in foreign tongues, beggars who looked at him with hungry eyes. He did not see danger. He saw opportunity. He saw a playground where no one knew his history, where no one knew he was the son who had wished his father dead. Here, he could be anyone. He checked into an inn, not the modest kind used by pilgrims, but a sprawling complex reserved for the wealthy. He threw a gold coin on the counter, a sum so large that the innkeeper's eyes widened and his demeanor shifted from indifference to groveling servitude. "The best chambers," the younger son commanded, his voice losing the tentative edge it had held days ago, "and send up wine, the kind you save for governors." That night, he sat on a balcony overlooking the city. He did not look back toward the direction of home. He looked down at the torches burning in the streets below. He poured a cup of dark, rich wine that would have been forbidden at his father's table, and drank it in one long swallow. The taste was bitter and sweet, like the freedom he had purchased. He told himself that he had finally arrived. He told himself that the ache in his chest was just fatigue from the journey, not the severing of a soul from its source. He was a master of his own fate now, and the far country was waiting to be bought. It did not take long for the younger son to transform from a traveler into a celebrity of the city. He did not just rent a room. He leased a villa with high walls and a courtyard that rivaled the one he had left behind, though this one lacked the warmth of a home. He filled it with servants who did not know his name, only his demands. He dressed himself in the fashion of the land, trading his simple tunic for robes of purple and scarlet, dyed with expensive pigments and woven with gold thread. He looked in the mirror and saw a prince, and where there is honey, the flies gather. They came slowly at first, then in a flood. Men who claimed to be poets, philosophers, and nobles who had fallen on hard times. Women who laughed too loudly and touched too freely, their eyes always darting to the rings on his fingers. They called him a visionary. They called him generous. They called him a friend. "You have a spirit unlike the others," a man named Lucius told him one evening. Lucius was a fixture at the son's table, a man with a sharp smile and a sharper appetite for other people's wine. Most men hoard their wealth like fearful mice. But you understand that wealth is energy. It must flow. "It flows because I command it," the son replied, signaling for more meat to be brought to the table. He enjoyed Lucius. He enjoyed the praise. It filled the silence that threatened to overtake him when the rooms were empty. The parties became nightly rituals. The villa was never quiet. Musicians played until dawn, their melodies strange and hypnotic, drowning out the thoughts that tried to surface in the younger son's mind. He spent lavishly, recklessly. He bought exotic animals just to watch them pace in cages. He commissioned statues of himself. He gambled on chariot races he did not understand, laughing when he lost enormous sums because he wanted to show the crowd that the loss meant nothing to him. He was building a kingdom of noise. But there was a peculiar quality to this freedom. It required constant maintenance. He noticed that the laughter of his guests always faltered when the wine ran low. He noticed that their affection was perfectly timed with the opening of his purse. There were moments, fleeting and terrifying, when he would catch a look in their eyes, a look of calculation, of predation. It was as if they were measuring him, not as a man, but as a carcass to be stripped. One night, after the guests had stumbled out into the morning light and the servants were sweeping away the broken pottery and spilled food, the younger son sat alone in the center of the chaos. His head throbbed with the dull ache of excess. He looked at the stain of wine on his expensive sleeve. For a split second, the image of his father's table flashed in his mind, the simple bread, the clear water, the quiet dignity of a meal blessed by gratitude. He pushed the memory away violently. "I am happy," he said aloud to the empty room. "I am living." He stood up, swaying slightly, and went to his treasury box. He opened it. The pile of gold and silver was still substantial, but it was visibly lower than it had been a month ago. A flicker of anxiety sparked in his gut. He extinguished it immediately with a wave of arrogance. He was young. He was rich. There was always more where that came from. He convinced himself that he could make it back, that he was investing in connections that would pay off. He did not understand that he was not buying friends. He was renting an audience. He did not see that the far country did not accept him. It only consumed him. He went out into the city that day and bought a necklace of pearls for a woman whose name he could not quite remember, simply because she had smiled at him and told him he looked like a king. He needed to hear it again. He was addicted to the validation, and the price of the drug was rising every day. The mirage was shimmering beautifully, hiding the desert that lay just beneath his feet. The end of the wealth did not come with a crash, but with a hollow scrape. The younger son stood in the center of his private chamber, the heavy lid of the iron chest thrown back. His hand reached down, fingers brushing against the cold bottom of the box. There was nothing left, not a single silver coin, not a copper mite. He stared into the darkness of the empty chest, waiting for it to be a mistake, a trick of the light. He shook the box, but it remained silent. The music that had played for months had finally stopped because the one paying the musicians could no longer afford the tune. He tried to laugh it off. He told himself it was merely a liquidity problem, a temporary delay. He had assets, surely. He had connections. He had the city in the palm of his hand. But as he stepped out of his villa to find a solution, he realized the city had changed overnight. The sky above the far country had turned a sickly shade of gray, the color of bruised iron. The winds, usually bringing trade ships and rain, had stopped dead. A severe famine had arisen in that land. It was not merely a shortage, it was a plague of emptiness. The grain silos were dusting over. The markets, once overflowing with exotic fruits and meats, were now battlegrounds where men fought over stale bread. Prices did not just rise, they soared beyond the reach of reason. The younger son walked to the house of Lucius, the man who had sat at his right hand during every feast, the man who had sworn eternal brotherhood over cups of the son's best wine. He knocked on the heavy wooden door, confident that Lucius would help him weather this storm. A servant opened the viewing slot. "The master is not seeing guests," the voice said flatly. "Tell him it is me," the son said, forcing a smile. "Tell him I have a business proposition." The door opened, but only halfway. Lucius stood there, not in silk, but in rough travel gear. His face was hard, stripped of the affability that alcohol had provided. He looked at the younger son not with friendship, but with the annoyance one feels toward a stray dog. "What do you want?" Lucius asked. "I find myself in a momentary bind," the son said, trying to maintain his dignity. "My funds are delayed. I need a loan, just enough to tide me over until the harvest returns." Lucius laughed, a dry, barking sound. "There is no harvest coming, boy. Have you not looked at the sky? The land is dying. And as for your funds, we all know the truth. You did not invest. You consumed. You are dry. But we are friends," the son stammered, his confidence cracking. "I fed you. I clothed you. You paid for an audience," Lucius replied coldly. "And now the show is over. Do not knock here again." The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel. The younger son went to another friend, a woman he had gifted with pearls. She claimed she did not know him. He went to the merchant who had sold him his chariot. The man threatened to call the guards if he did not leave the premises. One by one, the doors of the far country closed. The smiles vanished. The hospitality evaporated. He realized with a sickening jolt that he had never been a person to them. He had been a purse. Now that the purse was empty, the person was invisible. Hunger began to gnaw at him, a sharp physical pain that he had never known in his life. He returned to his rented villa only to find the landlord's men waiting. They seized his robes, his furniture, and his remaining trinkets to pay for the debts he had accrued. They stripped him of the purple and scarlet, tossing him a ragged tunic that smelled of mildew. He was thrown out into the street as evening fell. The city was no longer a playground. It was a predator. He walked through the alleyways, the cold stone biting into his feet. He saw others like him, shadows huddled in corners, but he could not join them. He was a foreigner, a stranger who had thrown away his birthright for a seat at a table that had just been overturned. The storm had hit, and he had no shelter, no anchor, and no name. Survival has a way of erasing pride, layer by agonizing layer. The younger son spent 3 days wandering the outskirts of the city, his stomach twisting into knots so tight he could barely stand. The hunger was not just a sensation, it was a voice, loud and demanding, drowning out every memory of honor or law. He chewed on dry grass. He drank from muddy puddles where the animals drank. He became a ghost, haunting the edges of the fields, watching the citizens of that country with envious eyes. He knew he had to work, but in a famine, labor was cheap and mouths were many. He approached a farm, then a warehouse, then a tannery. Everywhere the answer was the same: no work. Finally, desperate and trembling from weakness, he went to a citizen of that country, a harsh man with a face like tanned leather who owned a vast tract of land near the swamps. "I will do anything," the son whispered, his voice raspy from dehydration. "I am strong, I am educated, I can keep accounts." The citizen looked him up and down, seeing the soft hands of a boy who had never held a plow, seeing the desperate eyes of a beggar. He sneered. He did not need an accountant. He did not need a steward. He wanted to break this foreigner. "I have a job," the citizen said, spitting on the ground. "Go into my fields and feed my pigs." The word hit the younger son like a physical blow. Pigs. To a Jewish man, swine were not just animals. They were the embodiment of uncleanness. To touch them was to be defiled. To live among them was to be cut off from his people, his God, and his history. It was a curse. It was the lowest rung of existence. But the hunger screamed louder than his heritage. "I will do it," he said, his soul withering as the words left his lips. He was sent to the pens, a vast, muddy enclosure reeking of waste and rot. The pigs were massive, aggressive beasts, squealing and fighting for dominance. The younger son, who had once worn silk and perfume, now waded into the filth, carrying buckets of carob pods. The smell was overpowering, a thick, suffocating stench that clung to his skin and hair. He poured the slop into the troughs, and the animals surged forward, nearly knocking him over in their greed. He watched them eat. He watched the brown, fibrous pods crunch between their teeth. And then, the horror truly set in. He was jealous of them. These unclean beasts were better fed than he was. They had a master who valued them enough to keep them alive. He had no one. He sat in the mud, his back against a wooden post, watching the pigs devour the husks, his stomach cramped violently. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up a pod that had fallen into the dirt. He wiped it on his rag of a tunic and raised it to his lips. It was bitter, tough, and barely edible, but he chewed it. He chewed it with tears streaming down his face, mixing with the grime on his cheeks. He was eating the food of swine. He had fallen from the height of a beloved son to a level lower than a beast. He looked around, hoping for a scrap of mercy. Maybe a fellow worker would toss him a piece of bread. Maybe the owner would show pity, but no one gave him anything. In the far country, if you could not pay, you did not eat. He was completely alone. The isolation was absolute. The silence of the universe seemed to press down on him, confirming what he believed to be true. He was forsaken. He was nothing. He was a swineherd in a foreign land, dying by inches in the mud, while the memory of his father's house felt like a dream from 1,000 years ago. He curled into a ball, shivering as the night air grew cold, and for the first time, he did not dream of the future. He only prayed for the end. The lowest point of a man's life often comes in silence. It does not arrive with the crash of thunder or the wailing of mourners, but in the quiet, terrifying realization that the end has come. For the younger son, this moment arrived in the stillness of the pig pen. The hunger that had raged in his belly for weeks had settled into a dull, cold ache that seemed to freeze his very marrow. He sat amidst the animals, watching them sleep. They were content. They were fed. Their bellies were full of the husks that he was too proud to beg for and too human to digest properly. In that oppressive silence, something shifted. The text calls it coming to himself, a phrase that implies he had been someone else entirely for a long time. The madness of the far country, the intoxication of freedom, the fever of rebellion, it all suddenly broke, like a fever breaking in the night. The illusion dissolved. He looked at his hands, caked in the filth of the sty, and he no longer saw the hands of a prince or a rebel. He saw the hands of a dying man. Memory, sharp and unbidden, pierced through the fog of his starvation. It was not a memory of the gold he had wasted or the friends who had abandoned him. It was a memory of bread. He closed his eyes and saw his father's house. He saw the servants' quarters. He thought of the hired hands, the lowest rank of workers on the estate, men who had no inheritance, no bloodline, and no permanent place in the family. They were day laborers, living from wage to wage. Yet, in his memory, he saw their table. It was piled high with loaves. They ate until they were satisfied, and they still had food to spare. They threw crusts to the dogs that were better than the meal the son was currently staring at. The contrast was a physical blow. "How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare?" he whispered to the sleeping swine, "and I perish here with hunger." The word perish tasted metallic in his mouth. He realized he was not just poor, he was in the active process of dying. The far country had promised him life, but it was starving him. His father's house, which he had called a prison, was a place of abundance. He had traded a feast for a famine. He had traded the dignity of a son for the slavery of a stranger. The awakening was brutal because it stripped away his last defense, his pride. For months, he had told himself he could make it on his own. He had told himself that eating pig slop was better than admitting he was wrong. But hunger has a way of clarifying the truth. His independence was a lie. His autonomy was a death sentence. He understood now that the problem was not the famine in the land. The problem was the famine in his heart. He had severed himself from the source of life. The realization was not a warm, comforting light. It was a cold, hard mirror. He saw himself for exactly what he was, a fool who had burned his own kingdom to the ground. But in that vision, there was a tiny, desperate spark of logic. If the hired servants at home had bread, perhaps there was a way to survive, not as a son that right was gone, sold for wine and harlots, but as a worker. He did not dare to hope for restoration. He only dared to hope for survival. The awakening was not about love yet. It was about calculation. It was the desperate reasoning of a starving man realizing that the only place in the world where he might not die was the very place he had sworn never to return to. He looked at the horizon, invisible in the darkness, and knew that he could no longer stay in the mud. To stay was to die. To return was to risk shame, but perhaps, just perhaps, it meant bread. The decision to rise was the hardest physical action he had ever taken. His legs were weak from malnutrition, but his will had finally found a singular focus. He stood up, shaking off the dirt of the pen. He did not say goodbye to the citizen who had enslaved him. There was no debt left to pay. His life had been payment enough. As he began to walk, turning his back on the far country, his mind began to work furiously. He knew he could not simply walk through the gates of his father's estate and expect a welcome. He had humiliated the patriarch. He had wished him dead. By all the laws of their culture, the village elders had the right to stone him the moment he appeared. He needed a shield. He needed a plea. He needed a way to frame his return that acknowledged his total forfeiture of his rights. He began to construct a speech. It was not a speech of a son returning to a father. It was the petition of a criminal returning to a judge. He muttered the words under his breath, testing their weight, ensuring they sounded sincere and final. "I will arise and go to my father," he rehearsed, his voice raspy and dry, "and will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you.'" He repeated the phrase "against heaven." He realized now that his sin was not just a social error, it was a spiritual violation. He had broken the covenant. He had disrupted the divine order of the family. He had to admit that first. "I am no longer worthy to be called your son." This was the hardest part to say, but he knew it was the truth. He had cashed out his sonship. He had spent his birthright. There was no claim left to make. He could not ask for his room back. He could not ask for a seat at the table. To ask for those things would be to insult his father a second time. Then came the proposition, the only bargaining chip he had left. "Make me like one of your hired servants." This was his plan. He would not ask to be a son. He would not even ask to be a bondservant who lived in the house. He would ask to be a hired hand, a day laborer who slept in the bunkhouse, worked the fields, got paid a daily wage, and owed nothing to the master but sweat. It was a demotion so severe it was almost a different kind of death, but it was a safe death. Hired hands got bread. Hired hands were not beaten for the sins of the past. They were judged only by the work of the present. He clung to this speech like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. He recited it over and over as he walked. "Father, I have sinned. Make me a servant. Father, I have sinned. Make me a servant." It became the rhythm of his march. The journey back was a nightmare of endurance. He had no horse, no sandals that were fit for travel, and no money for food. He walked the same road he had ridden down in triumph months ago, but now every mile was an accusation. He passed the towns where he had spent his gold, keeping his head down, terrified that someone might recognize the fallen prince. He drank from streams and ate wild berries. His body wasted away further, his ribs protruding against his rags. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the mental torment. With every step closer to home, the fear grew. He imagined the look on his father's face, the cold, hard rejection. He imagined his older brother's sneer, the vindication in his eyes. He imagined the servants whispering as he, the former heir, took his place among them to shovel manure. He accepted it all in his mind. He accepted the shame. He accepted the scorn. He believed that if he could just get the words out, if he could just finish the speech before they drove him away, his father might grant him this one small mercy. He was not returning to be loved. He was returning to be employed. He was trading his freedom for survival, his pride for bread. The landscape began to change. The familiar hills of Judea appeared in the distance. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper. He saw the landmarks of his childhood. His heart hammered against his chest, not with joy, but with dread. He was a walking ghost, a scar on the landscape. He stopped to catch his breath, rehearsing the speech one last time, perfecting the tone of absolute brokenness. He was ready to beg. He was ready to crawl. He took the final step toward the valley of his father, unaware that the script he had written was about to be torn apart by a love he had completely forgotten. While the son was fighting the battle of survival in the mud, the father was fighting a battle of endurance in the silence. For the past months, the great house on the hill had become a place of quiet mourning. The servants moved with hushed steps, afraid to disturb the heavy atmosphere that hung over the estate. They whispered among themselves about the patriarch, a man who had once been the picture of strength and authority, but was now defined by a singular, obsessive habit. Every day, without fail, the father went to the edge of his property. He did not go to oversee the harvest, nor to instruct the reapers. He went to wait. He stood at the boundary where the cultivated land met the wild road, the very spot where his younger son had turned his back and walked away. The father would stand there for hours, his eyes scanning the horizon, looking for a silhouette that never appeared. The neighbors noticed. In a small village, privacy was a myth, and judgment was a pastime. The elders of the town shook their heads as they passed by. They muttered that the old man had lost his mind along with his fortune. They believed he should have declared the boy dead. They believed he should have performed the funeral rites, torn his robes, and sat in Shiva to wash his hands of the disgrace. To them, a son who demanded his inheritance early was a monster. A father who refused to disown him was a fool. But the father did not care for their whispers. His grief was not a passive thing, it was an active vigil. He knew the world his son had walked into. He knew the cruelty of the far country. He knew that the money would run out and that the friends would vanish. He feared not for his reputation, but for his child's soul. He woke up every morning with a pit in his stomach, wondering if this would be the day a messenger arrived with news of a tragedy, or if this would be the day the road remained empty once again. Inside the house, the older son watched this ritual with growing disdain. He saw his father's waiting as a weakness, a refusal to accept reality. The older son worked harder than ever, driving the oxen, managing the accounts, ensuring that the estate prospered despite the loss. He wanted to prove that he was the worthy one, the one who held the roof up while the father stared at the sky. But the father hardly seemed to notice the profits. His heart was not in the barn, it was on the road. The father prepared himself daily. He knew the law of the village. He knew the ceremony of shame that awaited a Jewish boy who had lost his money to Gentiles. If the son returned, the village would meet him with clay pots, smashing them at his feet to signify that he was cut off forever. They would mock him, spit on him, and banish him from the community. The father knew that if the boy came back, he would not just be facing a disappointed parent. He would be walking into a gauntlet of rejection. So the father waited, not to scold, but to intercept. He stood at the edge of the village because he knew that if the boy returned, someone had to get to him before the mob did. Someone had to absorb the shame before it could destroy what was left of the boy's spirit. The father's love was a strategic position. He was the watchman, guarding the gate not to keep the enemy out, but to usher the fallen in. He rehearsed no speeches. He prepared no punishments. He simply kept his eyes on the distance. willing the empty road to yield a traveler, holding on to a hope that defied all logic and all dignity. The day began like any other, with the heat rising from the ground in shimmering waves. The father stood at his post, his hand shielding his eyes from the glare. The road was empty, a long ribbon of dust stretching into the unknown. He was about to turn back, to accept that another day had passed without a miracle, when he saw it. A speck in the distance. At first, it was nothing more than a blur, a shadow moving against the light. A traveler, perhaps. A beggar seeking alms. A merchant lost on the way to the market. But the father did not turn away. He narrowed his eyes, his heart skipping a beat in his chest. He watched the way the figure moved. It was a slow, limping gait, the walk of a man who was broken, defeated, and exhausted. But there was something in the rhythm of the step, a familiar cadence that no amount of distance or rags could disguise. The father stopped breathing. He knew that walk. He had watched that boy learn to walk. He had watched him run through these very fields. It was him. The realization hit the father with the force of a physical blow. Compassion, hot and overwhelming, flooded his veins. He saw the rags even from this distance. He saw the slump of the shoulders. He knew instantly that the boy was not returning in triumph. He was returning in ruin. And then, the father looked toward the village. The men were in the town square. If they saw the boy first, the shouting would begin. The humiliation would start. The ceremony of cutting off would be enacted. The patriarch made a decision that would shatter every social norm of his culture. He did not wait. He did not call a servant. He reached down and gathered the hem of his long, heavy robes in his hands. He tucked them into his belt, exposing his legs, an act of utter shame for a dignified nobleman in the ancient East. Men of his stature walked. They never ran, and to run was to lose honor. To run was to be undignified. But the father ran. He sprinted down the hill, his sandals slapping against the hard earth. His breath came in ragged gasps. His heart pounded not just from exertion, but from a joy so fierce it felt like pain. He ran past the surprised stares of the workers. He ran past the gates of the village. He ran toward the figure that was still a long way off. The younger son, head bowed, rehearsing his speech of servitude, heard the sound of approaching footsteps. He froze. Panic seized his throat. He expected the village guard. He expected a mob. He expected his brother coming to drive him away. He looked up, squinting through the dirt and tears. He saw a man running toward him, robes flying, arms outstretched. The son flinched. He braced himself for a blow. He stopped walking, his legs trembling, ready to collapse into the dust. He opened his mouth to shout the first line of his apology, "Father, I have sinned." But the father did not stop. He did not slow down to listen. He collided with the boy. It was a collision of grace. The father threw his arms around the son's neck, pulling him into a crushingly tight embrace. He did not care about the smell of the pigsty that clung to the boy's skin. He did not care about the filth on the boy's clothes that stained his own expensive garment. He did not care about the lice or the sores. The father wept. He kissed the boy's neck, his face, his forehead. He kissed him again and again, silencing the speech that the son was desperately trying to stutter out. The son stood there, stiff with shock, his hands hanging limp at his sides, unable to comprehend what was happening. He had expected a judge. He had found a protector. He had expected to be interviewed. He was being held. The father's tears mixed with the grime on the son's face. In that embrace, on the public road, in full view of anyone who cared to look, the father was declaring something profound. He was taking the shame of the son upon himself. By running, by embracing the unclean, the father was saying to the world, "If you want to reject him, you must reject me first. He is under my covering." The son finally found his voice, a broken whisper in the middle of the father's shoulder. "Father," he choked out, "I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." He tried to finish. He tried to say, "Make me like one of your hired servants," but the father did not let him say it. The father pulled back, looking into the boy's eyes with a fierce, radiant love that burned away the shadows of the far country. The father ignored the request for employment because he was too busy restoring the relationship. The run was over, but the rescue had just begun. The son was safe, not because he had repented perfectly, but because the father had run wildly. The dust of the road had not yet settled around them when the younger son began to speak. He was trembling violently, his body rigid against the softness of his father's robes. The embrace was suffocating in its intensity, a physical weight of love that felt heavier than the guilt he had carried for miles. But the son needed to speak. He needed to confess. He needed to set the terms of his surrender before he could allow himself to be held. He could not accept this affection for free. The cost was too high, and his debt was too great. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look into the tear-streaked face of the patriarch. His voice was a dry croak, cracked by thirst and shame. He recited the words he had practiced in the pig pen, the words he had muttered to the rhythm of his limping feet for days. "Father," he gasped, the word feeling foreign on his tongue after so long, "I have sinned against heaven and before you." He paused, waiting for the blow. He waited for the father to nod in grim agreement, to acknowledge the magnitude of the offense. But the father only looked at him, his eyes shining with a fierce, terrifying joy. The father's hands were gripping the son's shoulders, not to push him away, but to anchor him, to keep him from collapsing under the weight of his own contrition. The son pressed on, desperate to finish the script. "I am no longer worthy to be called your son." This was the pivot point. This was the moment of truth. He took a breath to deliver the final line, the clause that would save his life, but end his sonship. He opened his mouth to say, "Make me like one of your hired servants." He wanted to ask for the bunkhouse. He wanted to ask for a wage. He wanted to enter a contract where he could work off his sin, coin by coin, day by day, until perhaps, years from now, he could look his father in the eye without burning with shame. He wanted to be an employee because employees can quit. Employees can earn their keep. Sons have to receive. But the words never left his lips. The father did not let him finish. The patriarch did not want a servant. He did not need another field hand. The moment the son declared his unworthiness, the father decided the conversation was over. There would be no negotiation. There would be no demotion. The father turned his head away from the son, not in rejection, but to shout commands to the servants who had finally caught up, breathless and stunned, standing a respectful distance away. The son stood with his mouth open, the sentence dying in his throat. He felt a sudden surge of panic. "Listen to me," he wanted to scream. "I am trying to tell you that I am broken. I am trying to tell you that I cannot be your son anymore. Let me earn it." But the father was deaf to his bargaining. The father ignored the logic of the penitent. By refusing to hear the request to be a servant, the father was obliterating the son's attempt to save himself. It was a severe mercy. The father knew that if he allowed the boy to become a servant, the boy would spend the rest of his life trying to pay back a debt that could never be settled. He would live in the house but remain an outsider in his heart. The father was not interested in repayment. He was interested in resurrection. The silence of the son was filled by the voice of the father, booming with authority and delight. The interruption was absolute. The apology was accepted, but the solution was rejected. The son realized, with a spinning head, that he had no say in this matter. He had come home to make a deal, but he had walked into a coronation. He stood there, covered in filth, smelling of death, while the father held him tight, refusing to let him downgrade his identity. The servants stood frozen for a moment, staring at the spectacle. They saw their master, the dignitary of the region, clutching a beggar who smelled of the sty. They saw the mud staining the master's silk. They saw the younger son, a ghost of the boy who had left, shaking and weeping. "Quick!" the father shouted, snapping the spell. The urgency in his voice was electric. It was not the calm command of a daily routine. It was the frantic energy of a rescue mission. "Bring the best robe and put it on him." The best robe. The servants exchanged glances. There was only one best robe. It was the father's robe, the ceremonial garment kept in the cedar chest, reserved for weddings, for high holy days, for funerals of kings. It was a robe of heavy, embroidered wool, a symbol of the head of the household. To put that robe on this boy was not just charity, it was blasphemy against decorum. But they ran. They scrambled back to the house, driven by the fire in the master's eyes. The son stood shivering, not from cold, but from shock. He tried to pull away. "Father, I am dirty," he whispered. "I will ruin it. Let me wash first. Let me go to the river." "No," the father said, his voice firm. He did not want the boy to wash himself. He wanted to cover him. When the servants returned, panting, carrying the heavy garment, the father took it from them with his own hands. He did not ask the son to lift his arms. He swept the robe around the boy's shoulders, wrapping him in warmth and weight. The smell of cedar and incense from the robe instantly overpowered the stench of the pigs. The filth was not removed, it was hidden. The shame was swallowed up by glory. The son looked down and saw not his rags, but the fabric of his father. He was wearing his father's dignity. Put a ring on his hand, the father commanded next. The steward stepped forward, trembling, holding the signet ring. This was not jewelry. This was the credit card of the ancient world. This ring stamped wax on legal documents. Whoever wore this ring spoke with the full authority of the estate. The son pulled his hand back, curling his scarred, dirty fingers into a fist. He could not take this. He had squandered the wealth. He had proven he could not be trusted with money. To give him the ring was madness. It was financial suicide. The father reached out, gently pried the son's fingers open, and slid the ring onto the finger. It was a perfect fit. The cold metal against his skin felt like a brand. It was a declaration of trust where no trust had been earned. The father was saying, I am not just taking you back, I am empowering you. You can ruin me again if you choose, but I will not treat you as a slave. And sandals on his feet, the father finished. A servant knelt in the dirt with a pair of leather sandals. The son looked at his own feet, calloused, cut, caked with the mud of the far country. In that culture, slaves went barefoot, sons wore shoes. To be barefoot was to be a captive, a person of no status. To wear shoes was to be a free man. As the servant strapped the sandals onto his feet, the son felt the final chain break. He could not run in these sandals. They were made for walking the grounds of an estate he owned. He could not work as a slave in these sandals. They were made for ruling. The transformation was complete, and it was terrifying. He had done nothing to clean himself. He had not taken a bath. He had not earned a penny. He had not even finished his apology. Yet here he stood, dressed in the highest honor the house could afford. He looked at his father, his eyes wide with disbelief. Why, he whispered, I lost everything. The father smiled, a smile that looked like the dawn breaking after a long, dark night. You lost your way, he said softly. You did not lose your place. The father turned the boy around to face the house, his arm draped heavily over the newly robed shoulders. The weight of the robe, the constriction of the ring, the strap of the sandals, they were physical proofs that the past was dead. The son was no longer the boy who had left, nor was he the beggar who had returned. He was something new, something forged in the fire of failure and the flood of grace. He was a son who knew for the first time what it truly meant to have a father. And as they began to walk toward the gates, the son realized he was not walking toward a trial, but toward a table. The father did not just open the door, he opened the storehouses. In a household of that size, meat was a luxury, eaten only on high holy days or at weddings. But there was one animal in the stall, a calf that had been grain-fed and fattened for a specific, undefined future celebration. It was the prize of the estate, the symbol of the family's greatest joy. Bring the fatted calf and kill it, the father commanded, his voice ringing out across the courtyard with a strength that startled the pigeons from the roof. Let us eat and be merry. The servants scrambled to obey. The atmosphere in the estate shifted instantly from the somber quiet of a grieving house to the chaotic, electric energy of a festival. The younger son, still dazed, still wrapping the heavy wool of the patriarch's robe tighter around his thin frame, watched it all unfold with a sense of vertigo. He had expected bread and water. He had expected a corner in the bunkhouse. Instead, he was watching the preparations for a banquet that a king would envy. He tried to speak to his father again, to protest the excess. Father, this is too much. The neighbors. They will talk. They know what I did. They know I wasted your money. To feast now, it is an insult to justice. The father turned to him, placing both hands on the boy's face, forcing him to look up. Justice? The father said softly, a smile playing on his lips. If I gave you justice, you would be at the gate with the dogs. I am not giving you justice, my son. I am giving you the kingdom. We do not celebrate because you were good. We celebrate because you are here. The feast began before the sun had fully set. The entire household was summoned. The field hands, The house servants, the stewards, everyone was called to the table. The barriers of rank and class were dissolved in the face of the father's overwhelming relief. Musicians were brought in, their flutes and timbrels filling the air with melodies that drove away the silence of the past years. The younger son was seated at the right hand of the father. He looked at the food piled high on the platters: roasted meat, fresh bread, figs, honey, wine that sparkled in the lamplight. He looked at his hands, adorned with the signet ring, resting on the table where he used to sit as a child. The shame was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, whispering that he was a fraud. But every time he looked at his father, the shame was silenced. The father was not looking at the past. He was laughing, eating, and serving the son with his own hands. Then the father stood up. The music died down. The chatter stopped. The patriarch raised his cup, his eyes sweeping over the crowded room, resting finally on the boy in the robe. "For this my son was dead," the father proclaimed, his voice trembling with the weight of the truth, "and is alive again." A gasp went through the room. To speak of death and life so plainly was shocking, but the father continued, his voice rising in triumph. "He was lost and is found." He drank from the cup, and the room erupted. The servants cheered. The musicians played faster, louder. The younger son sat there, tears streaming down his face, dropping onto the fatted calf. He finally understood. The celebration wasn't about his behavior. It wasn't about his repentant speech. It was about the father's victory over loss. The father had fought a war against despair for years, standing on that hill, waiting, and today the father had won. The feast was the trophy of a love that refused to bury its dead. While the house shook with the sound of dancing, the fields were quiet. The older son was finishing his day's labor. He was a man of routine, of discipline. He did not leave the furrow until the sun touched the horizon. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. Satisfied with another day of perfect obedience, he checked the fences. He counted the sheep. He did everything right, just as he had done every day since his brother had left. He walked back toward the main house, his muscles aching with the pleasant fatigue of honest work. He expected the usual evening routine, a quiet meal, a report to his father about the yield, and then sleep. He found comfort in the predictability. He found righteousness in the grind. But as he neared the perimeter of the courtyard, he stopped. A sound was drifting over the walls. It was not the low murmur of tired servants. It was music. Loud, rhythmic, joyous music. He heard the stomp of feet, the clapping of hands, the laughter of many voices. He frowned. It was not a feast day. It was not the new moon. No one had told him of a celebration. A cold spike of irritation went through him. He felt excluded. He felt the sudden, sharp sting of being an outsider in his own home. He walked to the side gate and saw a young servant boy running to fetch more water. "You there," the older son barked, his voice sharp. "Come here." The servant boy skidded to a halt, his eyes wide with excitement. He did not notice the dark cloud on the older son's face. "What is this?" the older son demanded, gesturing toward the noise. "What is happening in there?" The servant grinned, unable to contain the news. "Your brother has come," he exclaimed, breathless, "and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has received him safe and sound." The words hit the older son like a physical slap. Your brother, the wastrel, the traitor, the one who wished them all dead, he was back, and not just back safe and sound. "The fatted calf," the older son repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He killed the fatted calf?" "Yes, sir," the servant beamed. "The master is overjoyed. Everyone is dancing. You must come in." The servant turned to run back to the party, but the older son did not move. He stood rooted to the spot, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. A fire ignited in his belly, a hot, corrosive rage that burned hotter than any sun he had worked under. Safe and sound, after what he did, after the shame he brought on the family name, after the money he threw away on harlots and wine, and for this, he gets the calf. For this, he gets the music. The older son looked at his own clothes. They were stained with the dust of the field. He smelled of work. He had slaved for this estate. He had kept the walls standing while his father mourned. He had been the responsible one, the faithful one, the rock. And what did he get? Silence, duty, Work. He looked at the glowing windows of the house. He could see the shadows of people dancing inside. He imagined his brother sitting there, wearing the father's robe, laughing, eating the food that the older son had worked to grow. "I will not go in," he said to the empty air. The servant, who had lingered, looked confused. "Sir, but your father, he is expecting you." "I said I will not go in," the older son shouted, his voice cracking with bitterness. He turned his back on the house. He walked to a stone bench near the barn and sat down, crossing his arms over his chest. He preferred the darkness. He preferred his anger. He felt morally superior out here in the cold than in there with the hypocrites. He let the music wash over him, and with every note, his heart hardened. He began to tally his merits. He began to list his grievances. He built a wall of self-righteousness, brick by brick, separating himself from the grace that was flowing so freely just a few yards away. He was the good son, he told himself. And because he was good, he could not celebrate with the bad. He would stay outside, and his absence would be his protest. His father would have to choose, the son who broke the rules and got a party, or the son who kept the rules and got nothing. The shadow outside the door grew longer, darker than the night itself. The music inside the house was a living thing, pulsing against the stone walls, vibrant and relentless. It was the sound of a family made whole again. But the father, seated at the head of the table, felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He looked around the room, scanning the faces of the joyous servants and the weeping, grateful younger son. He counted the heads. And then he realized who was missing. The father stood up. He did not call for a servant to send a message. Just as he had run to the younger son on the road, he now walked out to the older son in the dark. He left the warmth of the feast, the light of the lamps, and the comfort of his guests. He stepped out into the cool, shadowy courtyard, moving toward the solitary figure sitting on the stone bench near the barn. The older son saw him coming. He did not stand up out of respect. He did not bow. He remained seated, his body rigid, his arms crossed tight against his chest as if holding his own ribcage together. The anger radiating from him was palpable, a silent scream in the quiet night. "My son," the father said gently, stepping into the circle of the older brother's resentment. "Why are you out here? The table is set. Your place is empty. Come in." The older son looked up. His eyes were hard, dry, and burning with a lifetime of unvoiced grievances. The father's kindness did not soften him. It incensed him. It felt like a mockery. "Come in?" the older son repeated, his voice shaking with a dangerous quietness. "You ask me to come in and watch that? You ask me to applaud him?" "I ask you to join your family," the father replied. The dam broke. The older son stood up abruptly, kicking the dust at his feet. He pointed a trembling finger at the father, an act of supreme disrespect, but he was past the point of caring about honor. "Look," he spat the word out, "for all these years I have slaved for you. I have been your servant. I have never disobeyed your command. I have never asked for my inheritance early. I have never brought shame to your name. I worked when the sun was high. I worked when the rain fell. I kept this farm alive while you stood on the hill watching for a ghost." He took a step closer, his voice rising, cracking with the pain of feeling invisible. "And yet, you never gave me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. Not once. You never threw a party for my obedience. You never killed a calf because I stayed." The father stood silent, listening to the poison drain from his son's heart. He heard the transaction in the son's words, "I worked, so you owe me." The older son did not see himself as a son. He saw himself as an unpaid employee who had finally realized he was being cheated. "But when this son of yours came," the older brother continued, refusing to say, "My brother, who has devoured your property with harlots and thieves, who smells of pigs and failure. For him you killed the fatted calf. For him you dance." The accusation hung in the air. It was a valid argument in the court of law. It was a logical argument in the world of commerce. But in the kingdom of the Father, it was a misunderstanding so profound it was tragic. The father reached out, but the older son flinched away. The father lowered his hand, his face filled with a sorrow different from the one he felt for the prodigal, but just as deep. "Son," the father said, using a term of deep affection, a reminder of the bond that could not be broken by work or by distance, "you are always with me." He let the words sink in. The older son had viewed his proximity to the father as a burden, a duty. The father viewed it as the reward. "And all that is mine is yours," the father continued. "You say I never gave you a goat. The goats are yours. The cattle are yours. The land is yours. You did not need to ask. You did not need to earn. You simply needed to realize that you were already the owner. You have been living like a slave in a house where you are the master's heir. You were waiting for a payment, while I was waiting for you to enjoy the possession." The older son stared at him, his mouth slightly open. The logic of grace was assaulting his logic of merit. He could not process it. He wanted to be paid for his goodness. The father was telling him that his goodness had already given him everything, if only he had eyes to see it. "It was fitting to celebrate and be glad," the father said, his voice firming up, becoming the voice of the patriarch once more. "For this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found." He emphasized the words, "your brother." He was reminding the older son that the bond of blood superseded the record of wrongs. He was challenging the older son to step out of the courtroom of judgment and into the banquet hall of mercy. The father did not beg. He did not apologize for his love. He simply stated the truth of the heart. Then he turned. He walked back toward the open door of the house, where the golden light spilled out onto the dark stones. He stopped at the threshold and looked back one last time. The older son stood alone in the darkness. The sound of laughter drifted out to him. He could smell the roasted meat. He could hear the rhythm of the dance. The door was open. The father had gone in. The younger brother was inside. The choice now belonged entirely to him. He could stay outside, wrapped in the cold comfort of his own righteousness, nursing his grudge, convinced that he was the victim of unfair love. He could remain in the field, a slave to his own pride, proving a point that no one cared about. Or he could drop his defenses. He could swallow his pride. He could admit that he, too, needed his father's grace, not for the sins he committed, but for the love he had rejected. He could walk through that door and become a brother again. The story does not say what he did. It leaves him standing there, suspended between the night and the light, between the bitterness of the law and the joy of the feast. The music continued to play, echoing into the silence of the fields, an invitation that would never be withdrawn, waiting for the moment he would finally decide to come home.